Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter is with me yet again. We're continuing to discuss Silas Marner. Hunter, how are you today?
I'm doing well, and it's going to be fun to wrap this novel up. I listened back to episode 1 yesterday, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Good. Sometimes listening back to yourself, I'm speaking from a first-person perspective here.
That's right.
For me, sometimes listening back to myself is really painful.
I think I've gotten past that discomfort. I know what I sound like, and it is bad, but I'm just used to how bad it is. And so now I just carry on. And I did send the episode to my friends who recommended this book to me, and they listened to it, and they also vote for wardrobe updates. So we're Team Wardrobe Update is catching up.
In lieu of a wardrobe update today, we could share the results of our listener poll. So far, the votes between no wardrobe updates and 4 wardrobe updates are split. We have had an even amount
Steven.
Yes, of people who said, don't really care for them, and people who said, yeah, I love the wardrobe updates.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Someone remarked in particular that it's not serious, that this is a serious podcast, and we're about serious business here, and that it introduces an unserious topic. And so perhaps they do make the podcast feel very disjointed and something to think about.
It's true.
Yeah.
We go from discussing sweaters and Razorback football into some topic like the themes in Silas Marner.
That's exactly right.
Well, let's just then right now start talking about Silas Marner.
Let's get serious.
We're on part 3 of our book discussion. In our first episode, we talked about chapters 1 through 6. In the second episode, we covered chapters 7 through 12. Now we're picking up today with chapter 13 and going to discuss from that point on through the conclusion of the novel. And then we have received, I'm very grateful that our listeners have also sent in some questions and thoughts about the book and the episodes. And so we will record a Q&R episode as well.
We have some good questions, and some of the different details of the plot have been brought up in the questions that we haven't had a chance to cover here. And it's actually great to get those questions because we can cover some of those finer details when we do our Q&R.
That's right. All right. At the conclusion of our second podcast discussion on chapters 7 to 12, we learned that a child who was Godfrey Cass's child with the opium addict that he was married to, a marriage that he had kept secret, child that he had kept secret, that the woman that he was married to was coming to expose him, going to go to a New Year's party where many people from the village of Raveloe were gathered. And on her way there, she is weak. She falls in the snow. And while she's lying there, her daughter, who she was holding, crawls into Silas Marner's house. Silas sees, but his eyesight is not very good, so he sees the little girl lying on his hearth in front of his fire, and he thinks that his gold, which had been stolen, is returned. And when he leans over to pick up the gold, to gather it up, he feels not gold, but soft curls. And so at this moment in the story, Eppie is introduced to us, and everything about Silas's life as it has taken place thus far is called into question. And the question then that we introduced at the end of the episode is, now Silas is open to this potential for redemption. So what will happen in his life from here to the conclusion?
Yeah. He goes and finds the little girl's mother. Her name is Molly. Molly has died in the snow. And he goes and finds her. He alerts the village. They identify the woman. Now, this woman is married to Godfrey Cass. And when Godfrey gets this news, he recognizes who this woman is and who this little girl is. And he decides to keep it secret. He's kind of relieved. It's like, oh, she's out of the picture now. I can marry this other woman who I'm in love with. Her name is Nancy. And so we get these two main characters, Silas and Godfrey, kind of begin to take some different moral trajectories based on the decisions that they've made.
Godfrey continues in the path that he had already established. He continues to keep this secret. And in this moment, his continued moral decision, his moral weakness in that moment continues to define him. So he wants this outcome that he desires. He wants to save face. He wants to marry Nancy Lammeter. And he wants all of those outcomes without the cost of his integrity. So from this point, Silas takes in Eppie. There's some people in the village who suggest that he can't possibly care for a child. But Dolly Winthrop, who we mentioned in our prior episode, she comes along to help him, to provide some guidance, to help him know how to care for a child. And he says, and Dolly affirms that as long as the child is well cared for, and because the child showed up in his house, why should he not take her in and become a father to her? So Godfrey marries Nancy and outwardly prospers. He embodies the respectable image that he wanted. And at this moment, as Silas takes in Eppie, he begins to learn new things, to be connected to not only Eppie in a fatherly way, but also to Dolly, and then increasingly to other people in the community as he looks to them for help, to know how to care for Eppie.
Yeah, this little girl becomes the way he starts getting connected to people, particularly Dolly. And through Dolly, he gets connected to people and to the church. We'll discuss that probably more here in a minute. And then Godfrey marries Nancy. He keeps this secret, and he suffers this kind of ongoing regret. And their marriage is childless. And so there's this picture of this kind of silent suffering and maybe even consequences that are happening in his heart and soul as Silas is becoming more and more alive, you might say.
And another contrast that's drawn between the two is that as Godfrey continues to keep this secret from everyone, from Nancy, the other person, Dunstan, who had known his secret, is still not present at this point in the story. So no one in the story knows his secret, and he keeps it to himself. In contrast to that, Silas actually begins to open up more and more about his life in Lantern Yard and about what had happened to him prior to moving to Raveloe. He explains what had happened to Dolly, and in doing so kind of breaks a barrier that he hadn't before this point. And then as the story goes on, Dunstan's body is discovered. In the novel, there's a continual mention of stone pits that are near Silas's house. Silas lives out at the edge of the village. There are these stone pits that are near his house. And one year, the stone pits are dry. Typically, they had water in them. And unexpectedly, one year, the stone pits are dry. And Dunstan's body is discovered in the bottom of the stone pit with Silas's gold.
Yeah, and for clarity's sake, should probably mention right here, after Silas takes the girl in, Dolly convinces him that she needs to be christened at the church, and he needs to give her a name. And this is where the name Eppie comes from. He tries to give her the name, you can pronounce it, Hephzibah, which is a biblical name. I can't access in my vast well of biblical knowledge where that name is, but it's a biblical name. And Dolly is confused by that, and they decide on Eppie as a shortened kind of version of that.
So he does name her Hephzibah
as
her christened name, and then they decide to call her Eppie.
Okay. Now, after that all kind of happens, the end of part 2 of the book comes to an end, and then part 3 opens, which is chapter 16. And chapter 16 skips ahead 16 years. So what the narrator is now going to show us is like, what's the trajectory all this has gone, and where's all this turned out? Dunstan is discovered, Dunstan's body is discovered, and the gold is discovered in the stone pits in that 16-year gap. So, you know, we're now, Eppie's now a teenager. Godfrey and Nancy have continued on in their life, and we get this kind of 16-year jump ahead, and that's where some of these threads start to come together, and the novel starts to come to an end.
Yes, that's such a good note, Hunter, and important to the novel. Thanks for clarifying that there is this jump that occurs at chapter 16. In those intervening years, as we enter chapter 16, we see that Silas has created a life for himself, for Eppie, that Eppie is happy, integrated into the life of the community, and doing well, and that Silas did this with the aid of Dolly and her son Aaron, who became a friend to Eppie, and he now has re-entered the church. So the church that Dolly was a part of, that she had invited him to, now has become Silas's church and his community as well. So he's established friendships, he's become a father to Eppie, and he is rooted again in a spiritual community and into the life of the town. And it's at this point in this jump forward, when Eppie is already older, that this discovery occurs of Dunstan and Silas's gold at the bottom of the stone pit.
That's right. We also get to see in this ending section what happens to Godfrey and Nancy. So after this 16-year jump, Godfrey confesses to Nancy that Molly, the little girl's mom, had been his wife, and that this was his little girl that he had fathered. And so there is, even though there's this long-term regret that he has, there is a little bit of a redemptive arc for Godfrey as well, in the fact that he's come clean, and especially come clean to his wife, and then they're going to come clean to Eppie and to Silas about what has happened. And there's going to be this decision, like Nancy and Godfrey think, well, the right thing to do is to offer to adopt Eppie and make Eppie their heir, and she doesn't want that, and she sees Silas as her father, and she's content with that. And Aaron is now going to marry her, so you can kind of see that coming a mile away. And Aaron and Eppie marry, and they live in close proximity to Silas.
Godfrey's confession to Nancy about Molly and about the child seems to be brought about to some extent by the discovery of Dunstan's body and Silas's gold. And Eliot uses this scene to depict how the past, even when it's buried, even when there are efforts made to suppress it or to bury it, how the past can resurface, even in spite of those attempts. And so Godfrey decides to confess to Nancy, and she responds in love and forgiveness. And then they collectively, as you mentioned, Hunter, agree to go see if Eppie would like to become their heir, and if she would like to even come live in their home. And there's an interesting development in Silas's character at this point in the story. Godfrey and Nancy's offer to Eppie in an instant has the potential to unseat Silas again, to sort of make him feel the weight of his two prior losses. So his loss in Lantern Yard, his loss of his gold. Eppie is very clearly his new treasure and is worth so much more than the gold that he had hoarded. And now he's faced with the prospect of, in a sense, losing her again. And yet in that moment, he decides to respond and say that it is Eppie's decision, that their land, what she could have through their family name, through attachment to them, is greater than what he could offer her. And so, interestingly, this is part of the arc of Silas's character, but also this redemptive arc that we see in the novel. And then, as you mentioned, Eppie decides that she wants to remain with Silas.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that. I did not clue in on that when I first read this, and you're right. There's a real potential for Godfrey and Nancy claiming Eppie to unseat Aaron or unseat Silas again, and yet he's learned to trust God, and I think that's a theme that we'll pick up a little bit later. So I'm fascinated that you picked up on that, and that's obviously part of the narrative.
You mentioned too, Eppie at the end of the story. Eppie marries Aaron. And so the final scene is one of a wedding that is full of joy, in which there's community gathered around. So sort of centered in this this marriage at the church, a joining of Eppie, who had chosen to remain Silas's daughter in spite of this revelation, Aaron, who is Dolly's son, and the joining of these two now dear friends into family in this way. And the depiction of them at that moment being surrounded by community is such a distinct difference from the way the novel begins, which is Silas in isolation, working and having only his work and his growing treasure.
Yeah, there's kind of this, they all lived happily ever after, kind of ending. But it's fascinating to step back and go, the narrative arc from isolation to the fullness here and the joy does kind of follow the narrative arc of Scripture, and it follows the narrative arc of redemption, where the end goal is a wedding feast of the Lamb, and there's the community of the redeemed, gathered around the Lamb and enjoying fellowship with the Lord Jesus. So I don't know if Eliot intended that, but there is certainly that mirror in the way the story unfolds.
Well, we wanted next to discuss some of the themes, and you just mentioned the first of those themes. There's this long arc of redemption that is visible in the story, in the development of Silas Marner, and, as you mentioned, in the story of Scripture. So let's talk about that, how it appears, how this long arc of redemption appears throughout the novel.
Yeah, what made me think of that was the time jump that happens in chapter 16, where it jumps 16 years ahead. And very intentionally, Eliot, it kind of ends the story with Silas, or it ends the part 2 of the story with Silas taking Eppie in, having her christened, and then doesn't give us a lot of details after that, and then wants you to see kind of where this went over the long haul. And I think there's a message in there that the effects of redemption tend to unfold slowly. And that's fascinating to me, in that we tend to think of redemption as having immediate benefits and immediate effects. I was suddenly changed, right? And there is immediate effect from redemption, but some of the best fruit of it comes from the long journey, and you can see it by taking the long perspective, and Eliot clearly does that. There's also maybe this backdrop too of Godfrey and his regret, and kind of the long effects of that, and him keeping his sin hidden, which he doesn't come clean until after these 16 years have unfolded, and he's kind of been carrying this burden for all this time, and it's kind of been slowly eating away at him. So I think in both ways, she is showing us how sometimes the negative consequences of our choices and decisions, where we can kind of seem to, quote, get away with it, still can unfold slowly and eat away at us. And at the same time, much of the fruit of redemption, although it has a beginning that's obvious, it also unfolds slowly until it gets brighter and brighter and brighter.
It's interesting that Eliot does show the effect of sin, of Godfrey's secrecy over time, and the effect of redemption in Silas's life. But she also works into this story this measure of freedom and a measure of redemption that Godfrey experiences when he is honest with Nancy. He's been afraid for so many years of how she would respond, and Nancy responds with forgiveness and extends love and grace towards him. And so there is a modicum of redemption there in that scene that Godfrey experiences, but the long-term effect of what he had chosen to keep hidden is something that is never undone in his life in the story.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate too. He, in confessing, he experiences forgiveness. He receives forgiveness, and Eliot's religion is one of the criticisms that I might make of her, of where she went in her own kind of religious beliefs, where she flattened everything out to a horizontal plane, and believed that most of how religion is experienced is kind of the relationships between human beings, and wasn't as concerned with the vertical dimension with God. So she's kind of showing how this has effects at the human level and scale, relationships between people. And that's accurate. It's just not the whole story, right? But Godfrey receives forgiveness. She doesn't depict it as from God, but she does depict him receiving forgiveness from his wife, from Nancy, and from his daughter, and Silas is even, as you mentioned a minute ago, Silas is not embittered toward him either. So there's a real sense that when Godfrey acknowledges his sin, the community pronounces this pardon over him, and they don't just say it to him, but they welcome him back in. He's always been in, but they continue to embrace him as a member of the community, and yet he has this like long-term scar, you could say, from keeping this hidden. And I think that's very accurate. I mean, even people who have come to faith in Christ and experienced the wonders of forgiveness, they also still carry some of the scars. Now, the scars make the forgiveness sweeter, right? They make grace sweeter. And yet, if you ask them, like, well, would you go back and redo that decision if you could? They're like, yeah, of course I would, you know?
I think that reinforces what we've mentioned a couple of times now, that this story shows that our choices, even seemingly private ones, shape our lives and have an impact on the people around us. A second theme that we noted, Hunter, that takes shape particularly in this section of the novel, but really is displayed as you look back at the whole novel, is the kindness of God's sovereignty.
Yes, and Eliot puts this on the lips of Dolly. And Dolly kind of preaches a message of the kindness of God's sovereignty, even though it's completely mysterious and not understandable, right? And she does it in her very simple kind of folk language. There's a long section where Dolly has been ruminating clearly on the fact that Silas was betrayed by his community in Lantern Yard, and this casting of the lots that happened when the lot fell to him and he was accused of this crime he didn't commit. And she is really bothered by that, and she's been chewing on that. And there's a long section of dialogue that comes in chapter, it's the beginning of part 2, chapter 16. Yeah. There's a long section of dialogue that comes in chapter 16 where she's really talking this out, and trying to share with Silas the sense, she's made of it. It's a tough section to read because Eliot writes it in Dolly's dialect, and so your brain can get twisted, but it's pretty easy to follow what's happening. And so, for example, she says this: Master Marner, she said one day that she came to bring home Eppie's washing, I've been sore puzzled for a good bit with that trouble of yourn and the drawing of lots, and it got twisted backwards and forwards, and I didn't know which end to lay hold on. But it come to me all clear like that night when I was sitting up with poor Bessie Fox. This is a lady she's been taking care of, as is dead and left her children behind. Bessie's now dead, God help him. It come to me as clear as daylight, for whether I've got hold on it now or could anyways bring it to my tongue's end, that I don't know, for I often make a deal inside me as it'll never come out. And so what she's saying here is like, I've been ruminating on this, and I think I've made a little bit of sense out of it. I'm not sure if I can describe to you the sense I've made out of it. She goes on and she says, if they'd have done the right thing by you, if they could, isn't there them, and the them is capitalized, them as that was making on us and knows better and has a better will? So she's saying, doesn't God have a better will? Mm-hmm. And that's all as ever I can be sure on. And everything else is a big puzzle to me when I think on it. So what she's kind of come to is, it doesn't make any sense that they did you wrong in the casting of lots. But I do know there's a them, capital them, a God who has a better will. And that will is mysterious. It's a puzzle to me, but I do know it. And then she says, and all we got to do is trust him, Master Marner, to do the right thing as far as we know, and to trust him. For if us as knows so little can see a bit of good and rights, we may be sure as there's a good and rights as bigger, nor that what we can know. I feel it in my inside as it must be so. And if you could but have gone on trusting, Master Marner, you wouldn't have run away from your fellow creatures and been so alone. And so she's basically saying, hey, even you running away and you coming here and living this lonely life you lived, like that was an inability to trust that there was a good higher power, so or a good God above who has a sovereign plan. And so Dolly has just rebuked him a little bit here, and yet in a way that also acknowledges even that God worked together for his good. So this is the theme of trusting God's sovereignty. We get to see a little bit of how it plays out. Dolly says we don't see everything, but we see a little bit of how this has played out, and I think that's a huge lesson in the novel. And it's also the one place in the novel where Eliot seems to get more vertical rather than just horizontal in her religion or in how she depicts religion. And I found that extremely gratifying.
Yeah. In this section, it's a little more overt. Throughout the novel, and particularly in this part of the story, I think that Eliot does hold on to this sense of providence, a sense of moral order, and a sort of, like, as you're saying, Hunter, Eliot includes in the novel a way that God causes justice and redemption and restoration to unfold over time and throughout time, and is even maybe wrestling with that a bit, like the way that there is this mysterious element to our relationship with God, with Providence, and how so much of this, as she's written in the novel, is due to the character's choices. But what happens when, like what happened to Silas, outside of his control? What happens in a life when those sorts of things are done to a person, and then in the examination of that person's response?
Yeah.
Well, a third theme that is present in the novel is this idea of this question of what is true, enduring wealth. And that's a theme that is very clear.
Yeah, that's right.
Unlike this wrestling with Providence that sort of weaves in and out and is a little unclear as to whether Eliot sees redemption as occurring at all from this vertical level or on this vertical plane, or just on the, as you said, horizontal or human plane, Hunter. She definitely includes a sense of what she believes to be true, enduring wealth.
Yes, and I think there's actually two examples of this, two ways this is depicted in the novel. One is obvious. The other one is a little bit more subtle, but the obvious one is the difference between his gold and the child. So one is what we would literally call wealth, and yet it's not true wealth, and the other is true wealth, this relationship, and the world opens up. But I think there's a more subtle contrast here, too, between the Cass family, who has material wealth and prosperity and are the aristocrats or the gentry, of the town, and Silas and his more simple life that's rich and full, and Godfrey, who has this wonderful social standing and this family generational wealth, but he's kind of silently suffering because of his sin. And then there is the obvious joy and community that Silas gets to enjoy. So I think that's another way this theme of like true wealth versus enduring wealth is depicted. And it's a little bit more subtle than the juxtaposition between the gold and the girl.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this brings us to the conclusion of Silas Marner, Hunter.
Yeah. How does it end? Tell us how the novel ends. What's the conclusion?
It ends with the scene of Eppie's wedding that we mentioned earlier in this podcast episode. And interestingly, I mean, we've already also mentioned that the novel opens with Silas in isolation and closes with him rooted into family life, a robust family life, the life of the church, and the life of the community, the greater community surrounding him. And so it concludes with this image of Eppie and Aaron, their happy marriage, and Silas, their among friends. So in great contrast to where the novel started. And interestingly, at the beginning of the novel, and then again, when Silas loses his gold, there's a sense in Silas's mind that he has been wronged, and that some sort of justice needs to be done to right the situation, or that there's this desire for justice in whatever way that might look. So in the first instance in which Silas was wronged, his friend William seemed to benefit from Silas's betrayal. In the second instance in which Silas was wronged, he lost his gold, and it's mysteriously gone. And in neither of those situations is a strict sort of justice enacted, but the redemption actually takes place through Silas reopening himself to the life of the community and to God, and through Dolly's invitation to church and her friendship and her true, simple faith, he is restored to not only position in community, but into spiritual community, and regains, so it seems, some sort of trust in God and in the people around him. So the novel doesn't close with any dramatic scenes of justice. There's never this sort of justice enacted, but in a sort of quiet harmony, in Eppie's marriage, in contentment, and in the warmth of community.
Yeah. And it did occur to me as you were describing that, and we should probably mention this piece, there's a chapter called Conclusion, which is just what you described. There's a short chapter right before that where Eppie and Silas wants to show Eppie Lantern Yard, and he makes the journey back to Lantern Yard to show Eppie, and Lantern Yard is gone. Mm-hmm. And it's been built over and covered over. So there's this picture of this place of injustice and evil. It's gone, mm-hmm. and there's also, I think, an echo of Revelation there, where it is gone. It is no more, and that also is kind of a fitting bit of conclusion to this, that he can't go back there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that, Hunter. It's an interesting scene thrown in right at the end of the story. Well, we are going to record a Q&R episode, and we've gotten some great feedback, good questions. Some have to do with faith and community, the link between the two. One about this situation where the religious community cast lots. What is that about? Which is a great question, because the casting of lots appears in Scripture. So that's a good wonder. And then an interesting note about a theme or a repeated sort of scene or device in the novel in which Silas Marner has these catatonic fits. And so one of our listeners mentioned those and said, you didn't really mention that. So we're going to talk about that some in next week's episode. Thank you all for listening. We love hearing from you. You can continue weighing in on the aforementioned survey. So if you are pro wardrobe updates or against wardrobe updates, you can let us know that. You can always, anytime, send questions, suggestions, articles to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.